We're announcing our first genealogy-based serial rapist case here in Fresno. Although we've had several other cases, the Golden State Killer, most recently Debbie Dorian, that were similar, this is our first serial rapist case here in Fresno that we'll be announcing the arrest for.
When the DNA results came back, every detective in the room went silent. For years, they thought the trail had gone cold, that the man behind a string of brutal attacks had vanished, maybe even died. But he hadn't. He was alive. He was free, and all this time, he'd been hiding in plain sight. I'm standing here in Fresno County, California, a place where families have been trying to forget the terror that once stalked these quiet streets. A city that learned the hard way that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they live next door. For a decade, Fresno lived under a shadow. Women vanished. Others survived but were left with scars that time refused to heal. And every time detectives thought they were close, the evidence slipped through their fingers like smoke. Until now. Because this week, everything changed. A 55-year-old man named Cesar Flores, someone neighbors described as quiet, polite, ordinary, was arrested. Not for theft, not for fraud, but for something far darker, something that ripped through 5 lives and nearly broke a city's spirit. DNA breakthrough leads to arrest of suspected serial rapist, Cesar Flores. That's the headline flashing across every major news outlet tonight. But headlines don't tell you how a city breathes again after years of fear. They don't show you the faces of the women who waited. And they definitely don't show you what it costs to catch a ghost. For those watching, I need you to understand this. This isn't just a story about crime. It's a story about time, about patience, about the kind of truth that hides until science forces it to speak. Because here's what most people don't know. Flores wasn't on anyone's radar. No one suspected him. He had a job, a home, a life that blended perfectly into the background. He was invisible. Until his own DNA betrayed him. A single cotton swab, a single trace, left behind years ago at a crime scene. Technology back then wasn't strong enough to read it, but technology today, it remembers. And when those new machines ran the old samples through, something happened that no one in that lab will ever forget. The computer flagged a match. That moment, that quiet click in a sterile lab, changed everything. The past finally had a name, and that name belonged to a man who thought he'd escape justice forever. Cesar Flores, 55 years old, a man who lived among the very people he once hunted, a man whose victims spent years thinking no one would ever believe them. But DNA doesn't care about time. It doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. Imagine this. You're walking down a street you've known your whole life. The same block where kids ride bikes and neighbors wave good morning. Then one day, police cars fill that same street. The quiet man who always kept his yard clean is in handcuffs. And you're told, he's the reason half the city stopped walking home alone after dark. That's what happened here in Fresno. This city, once calm and forgettable, is now at the center of one of the most chilling arrests California has seen in years. And it all began with a test that turned silence into evidence. Before we go deeper, if stories like this remind you that evil hides behind ordinary faces, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to hear, you won't forget. And if you scroll past this story like it's just another headline, then ask yourself, when the next monster hides in your neighborhood, would you even notice? Police say Flores's crimes date back years, maybe longer. Some of the attacks happened in quiet neighborhoods, others near public places where safety was supposed to be guaranteed. Victims described a calm, calculated man. Someone who seemed to know when they'd be alone. Investigators believe he stalked his victims, waited for the right moment, then disappeared without a trace. Forensic teams found DNA, but it matched no one in the system. It was like chasing a ghost, and in the years that followed, evidence piled up. Case files grew thicker, Hope grew thinner, families moved away, and detectives, one by one, were reassigned to other cases. The city tried to forget, until a new kind of detective took over, one who didn't just read files, but reread the future of science itself. It was that decision, to retest, to believe that DNA could speak louder this time, that cracked open everything. And when the lab results came back, one thing was clear. The man who haunted Fresno's nights was right here all along. Tonight, the victims' families are finally hearing a name they thought they'd never get. Some cried, some smiled through tears, others just stood silent, letting the weight of it all sink in. Because when a city finally gets closure, it doesn't celebrate, it exhales. But here's the part that makes this story unlike any other. The same technology that caught him could expose thousands more like him. The question isn't how he was found, but how many others are still out there, hiding behind the same kind of quiet smile. Coming up next, Fresno in fear, the nights when women stopped walking home, and the one pattern that finally led police to believe they weren't dealing with chance. They were dealing with a predator. Fresno, California, a place that once felt small, safe, familiar, where the sunsets painted orange skies over quiet rooftops, and the only thing people feared was tomorrow's heat. But fear doesn't arrive with thunder. It creeps in quietly. It began on a warm night in 2016. A woman, young, full of life, vanished on her way home from work. No one heard her scream, no witnesses, just silence. The next morning, Fresno woke to a whisper. Something happened. Within weeks, those whispers became a pattern. Assault after assault, different streets, different faces, the same nightmare. People started changing their routines. Bars closed earlier. Women called friends just to say, "I made it home." Every few weeks came another victim, another neighborhood on edge. The first thing fear takes from you is sleep. And Fresno couldn't sleep anymore. Every noise outside a window sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like a warning. We locked every window. Nobody walked alone anymore. That sentence, "Nobody walked alone anymore," became the city's anthem of fear. Detectives worked around the clock. They searched alleys, questioned drivers, collected everything: hair, fibers, fingerprints. Each time, they found the same thing: DNA, a ghost's signature. But every test came back empty. No match, no identity. The system was telling them a lie, that the man didn't exist. That's the thing about monsters. They know how to blend in. He was smart, precise, cold. He chose nights when street lights flickered out, and streets without cameras. He waited for the moment when fear was most alone. Every victim had a different life, but the same story afterward. The isolation, the self-blame, the silence. They'd tell themselves maybe it was over, that no one would believe them if they spoke. But he wasn't done. One case officer told me later, "It wasn't the violence that kept me up. It was the waiting for it to happen again." And it did happen again. Every few months, another attack. Different locations, different women, the same pattern. Calm entry, no witnesses, vanish. Detectives couldn't connect the dots until it was too late. People started calling him the Shadow Man, not because anyone saw him, but because they never did. I spoke to an elderly woman who'd lived in Fresno since the 70s. She told me, "In those years, we stopped trusting sunset. When the sky turned orange, we went inside." Fear changes your definition of home. It turns light switches into armor, locks into prayers. Inside the police station, the mood was no different. Frustration hung like fog. Investigators sat around boards covered in photos and red strings, the classic crime scene wall, but no clear trail. Some nights they argued, some nights they cried. Most nights they just stared at the same DNA code that mocked them for years. "We were chasing shadows," one detective told me. "Real people were hurting, and all we had were numbers on a screen." Meanwhile, Fresno transformed. Gated communities sold out overnight. Hardware stores ran out of padlocks. Even local radio stations started ending broadcasts with "Stay safe out there." That was how normal fear became. It was part of the evening routine. But it wasn't just women who were afraid. Men felt powerless too. Fathers walked their daughters to the bus stop and stayed until it drove away. Brothers took night shifts just to walk sisters home. Entire families built schedules around a ghost no one had seen. You can't see fear on a map, but you can feel it in every house light that never turns off. One victim I spoke with didn't want her face on camera. She just wanted people to know she wasn't a headline. She said, "I lost a lot more than a night. I lost who I was." Her voice shook when she said it, but there was something strong beneath the pain, the refusal to be a ghost in her own story. That's why we tell these stories. Because when fear wins, memory dies. Inside Fresno PD, they formed a small task force. 2 detectives, 1 forensic analyst, and a crime tech who'd refused to quit even when the funding ran out. They called it Operation Nightfall. Their mission was simple: find the shadow. Night after night, they reviewed every report since 2016. Car routes, lighting patterns, victim statements. They found similarities in timing, distance, even the weather. He attacked when it was humid, when the air was still. When fear had no wind to carry screams away. They were close, but not close enough. By the 5th year, the case was a sore spot in the community. Local news called it the silenced files. Some families moved away. Others stayed and refused to let their pain be forgotten. I met a mother whose daughter was one of the survivors. She told me something I'll never forget. When the city stopped looking for him, we started looking at each other different. We stopped trusting men, stopped trusting neighbors, sometimes even ourselves. That's what fear does. It doesn't just haunt you, it changes you. Police officers began retiring, burnt out and haunted by unsolved names. Younger detectives inherited the case, wondering if it was cursed. Files kept growing while answers stayed small. And somewhere in this same city, maybe in a quiet house with a neat lawn, Cesar Flores was watching the news about his own crimes, knowing no one would connect them to him. For years, people believed he was a drifter, someone passing through. But the truth was worse. He was homegrown. Born here, raised here, hidden here. He ate at the same diners, shopped in the same stores, and no one ever looked twice. He was the definition of ordinary. And that's what made him terrifying. These women never got to tell their stories loud enough. Their voices were buried under headlines that moved on and comments that didn't care. So if you're still watching and you can't even press subscribe, ask yourself why. Are their voices too inconvenient for you to keep alive? Because every time you scroll past a story like this, someone like him stays invisible a little longer. As the years passed, something shifted inside the department. A new detective joined. Young, determined, a believer in technology the old guard didn't trust. He looked at the files and asked one simple question. What if the answer isn't in the streets, but in the blood? It was that question that reignited the hunt for the shadow. He sent old samples to a new lab hundreds of miles away. He believed the story wasn't over. It was just waiting for the right science to finish it. And that belief, that one spark of defiance against fear, would change everything Fresno thought it knew about this case. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from new evidence. It comes from old evidence finally getting a voice. Up next, how a forgotten swab, left in storage for years, became the key to unmasking a predator who thought he was untouchable. The attacks weren't random. Each one showed planning, control, almost ritual. The evidence told a story long before anyone realized it. And when investigators started connecting the dots, a chilling pattern began to take shape. The first victim was in 2016. A woman attacked while walking home from her shift at a local grocery store. The neighborhood was safe. The streets were familiar. And that's what made it perfect for him. He followed her, waited until her phone battery died. He knew the routes without cameras, the corners without light. She never saw his face, but she remembered his silence, said it felt practiced. Detectives found traces of DNA, but when they ran it through CODIS, the National Crime Database, it came back empty. The man didn't exist on paper. Still, they logged it, hoping one day a match might appear. They didn't know it was just beginning. 2017. Another attack. This time, a young teacher leaving a late-night meeting. The same precision, the same fear, the same invisible signature left behind. Police noticed something strange. Every incident happened near places he could vanish fast, alleys, drainage paths, dark parking lots. And every time, he left that same genetic fingerprint. The same pattern, the same ghost, the same invisible signature was left behind every time. But it belonged to no one. That single line haunted detectives more than anything else on those reports. They knew what he was doing. They just didn't know who he was. This was no random offender. He was meticulous, strategic. He attacked like someone rehearsing, as if each act was part of a larger plan. One officer described it best. He's not hunting for opportunity, he's creating it. By the time of the third attack, police had formed a special unit. They ran patterns on weather, lighting, even moon cycles. He struck during half-moon nights, when shadows fell wider but still gave just enough light to see his victims. That detail alone told detectives something crucial. This was a man obsessed with control. He wanted to see their fear, but never be seen himself. And then came 2018, the year everything changed. A survivor fought back. She scratched him, drew blood, and this time, they had a stronger DNA sample. When the lab ran it, the code popped up again, identical to the previous cases. The same mystery man, the same pattern, and still, no match in any database. To the system, he was a phantom. To the victims, he was a nightmare that kept coming back. Each case fit together like puzzle pieces from a story no one wanted to believe. He wasn't choosing victims at random. He was targeting women who lived alone. Women who worked late. Women who trusted their own neighborhoods. He studied their lives. He knew their routines. He waited for their most ordinary nights and turned them into the kind they'd never forget. Forensics couldn't identify him, but psychology could describe him. Calm, calculated, narcissistic, the type who thinks the world owes him quiet. When you talk to detectives about this case, there's one emotion that always slips through the professionalism: shame. Not because they failed, but because he didn't. One investigator said to me, "It's not the crimes that haunted us. It's knowing he was still out there buying coffee like the rest of us." And that's when fear turned into obsession. They began reanalyzing everything, every scrap, every fiber, every partial print. They knew they weren't chasing luck anymore. They were chasing a pattern, a man who thought repetition would protect him. But patterns always leave traces. The deeper they dug, the more they realized something else. He wasn't just attacking women. He was sending a message. He was daring the police to find him. The timing of his assaults, the gaps, the routes, even the items left behind, all felt intentional. As if each one said, "I'm still here, and you still can't catch me." This wasn't madness, this was design. By 2020, Fresno PD had 5 confirmed cases. Each one carried his invisible mark. 5 women, 5 timelines, 5 unanswered questions. And by then, the city had started to move on, or at least tried to. New crimes took the headlines, new tragedies took the spotlight, and that's when he stopped. No more attacks, no more leads, nothing. He stayed free because people stopped paying attention. He stayed free because people stopped paying attention. don't be one of them. Subscribe so stories like this don't vanish again. Or drop a comment explaining why silence feels safer. Because silence is the only thing that ever protected him. In 2021, the case was reclassified as a cold file. Evidence was sealed, archived, and boxed away. Years of pain reduced to folders and numbers. The city healed, but the story didn't end, because evil never really ends. It waits. Patiently, somewhere inside this room sat the truth. A drop of blood, a strand of hair, the final piece waiting for someone to believe it still mattered. And then, a new detective, younger, hungrier, asked the question everyone else stopped asking. What if the system's wrong? What if the match isn't in the database, but in the family tree? That one question reopened everything. He didn't know it yet, but the answer was already waiting, deep inside the code of a man who thought he'd escaped forever. Because when science catches up to sin, the truth always has your name on it. Up next, the forgotten evidence. How one tiny swab of DNA would bring a ghost back to life. By 2021, the case was fading. 5 victims, 5 files, and a city ready to move on. Inside Fresno Police Headquarters, the Nightfall Task Force, the team that once hunted a ghost, had been reduced to one man, one detective, and a mountain of unfinished stories. They called him Detective Michael Ruiz. Not a hero, not a legend, just a man who couldn't sleep knowing a predator might still be out there. He joined the department years after the first case broke. He didn't know the victims personally, but he carried their names like promises. When everyone else had moved on, he didn't. While others were writing new cases, Ruiz was reopening old ones. Because sometimes, justice doesn't start with new evidence. It starts with someone refusing to forget. He spent weeks in this very room, cold, silent, filled with the smell of cardboard and time. Every file told the same story, different dates, same pain. Faces of women who waited for answers that never came. Until one night, while reviewing an evidence index from 2018, Ruiz noticed something small. A sealed plastic bag, logged but never analyzed with the newer technology. Inside it, a single cotton swab. To most people, it was just another piece of forgotten evidence. But to Ruiz, it was a whisper. He knew that back in 2018, the lab techs had tested that swab using old methods that could only detect limited DNA markers. But by 2022, new technology could read 10 times deeper, through contamination, through degradation, through silence. So Ruiz made a decision that would change everything. He reopened the case file, a file covered in dust but filled with pain, until one detective refused to give up. He reopened the case file, a file covered in dust but filled with pain. He sent the sample to a private genealogy lab, not through official channels, not through bureaucracy. He paid the rush fee out of his own pocket, and for the first time in years, Fresno PD waited, not in frustration, but in faith. Weeks passed. Days turned into nights. Ruiz checked his email every morning like a ritual, and with each passing day, the weight of the victims' faces grew heavier. He'd taped their photos to his wall, not as evidence but as reminders, each one staring back at him as if asking, "Did you forget me too?" No, he hadn't. He'd talk to those photos at night, just to keep himself from giving up. "I don't know your names by heart," he'd say, "but I promise, I'll find his." The lab emailed back. They needed more time. The DNA was old, partial, contaminated, but there was something there, something the old machines missed. So Ruiz waited again. He read every report, cross-checked every map, replayed every victim statement. He started to notice things, times, places, overlaps. Every attack happened within 12 miles of a single point. an industrial zone in southwest Fresno, and at the center of it all, one street, one cluster of houses, one man's address. But Ruiz couldn't act on instinct alone. He needed proof. He needed that DNA. And then it happened. A notification blinked on his screen. Subject line: partial genetic match, pending confirmation. He opened it. The lab had found a link. Not a direct match, but a relative, a bloodline. Someone connected to the same DNA sequence found on all 5 victims. It was the first real lead in almost 6 years. Ruiz didn't speak for a full minute. He just stared at the screen. 6 years of dead ends, and suddenly a door had cracked open. He called the lab immediately. They confirmed it. The profile belonged to a family name that hadn't appeared in the system before. That name would eventually lead him to one man. A man whose DNA had haunted the files for years without a face, and that man was closer than anyone imagined. It's strange how justice hides, sometimes not in a courtroom or confession, but in a forgotten bag sealed with dust. That single cotton swab, overlooked, ignored, nearly discarded, carried the answer Fresno had been waiting for. It carried a name, and then a single cotton swab changed everything. It wasn't fingerprints, it wasn't witnesses, it wasn't a lucky confession. It was science, and blood that never forgot. The forgotten cotton swab from the evidence locker was more than fabric and fiber. Inside it lived a record. Billions of chemical letters that remember every ancestor, every generation, every secret. For 6 years that cotton swab sat silent. But in 2022, technology caught up to time. And when that sample was uploaded into a new type of database, something extraordinary happened. A computer began to search, not through mugshots or police files, but through family trees. This process is called genetic genealogy. It doesn't look for one person. It looks for everyone connected to that person, like a family map drawn from blood instead of ink. Across America, millions of people have taken home DNA tests. They spit in a tube, mail it off, and a few weeks later, they get a chart showing their heritage. Irish, Mexican, Filipino, African, every strand of identity laid bare. Most do it for curiosity, to find roots, not suspects. But when those results are uploaded to public sites, places where relatives can share and compare, a door quietly opens for detectives. Because every crime scene sample has relatives too. Somewhere, someone shares that blood, and that means every killer is part of a family. When the lab in Virginia entered the Fresno DNA into the database, the computer began comparing it. Millions of strands against millions of others. For 18 hours straight, the servers ran. Then, a ping. Not a full match, but close. A partial connection to a man in Bakersfield who had taken a genealogy test 4 years earlier. He wasn't the suspect. He was a cousin. From that single cousin's DNA, analysts began building outward, finding parents, siblings, distant aunts. Within days, a tree appeared on the screen, branches stretching across California. Each branch was a possibility, each leaf a clue. The family's history reached back to Mexico. Large, extended, ordinary. No criminal records, no red flags. Just regular people whose shared DNA now held the key to Fresno's darkest secret. Detectives called it Operation Bloodline. Every name on that chart was cross-checked against employment records, ages, addresses, and locations of the old attacks. And that's when the coincidences started stacking up. One branch led to a man who'd lived in Fresno all his life. Mid-50s, quiet job, no history of violence. But his home sat within a 10-mile radius of every single crime scene. His name was Cesar Flores. The DNA didn't say the words, but every number screamed them. So how could a cousin's DNA catch a criminal? Think of it like a family photo. Even if you cut one face out, the people beside it still tell you who belonged there. Genetic genealogy does the same thing. It doesn't need the suspect, just the relatives. From their DNA, scientists can rebuild the missing face, the missing branch. Piece by piece, they follow the trail until only one person fits. Age, gender, geography, ancestry. It's like watching science draw a portrait out of thin air. In this case, every line led to one name, and every cell pointed home. For the analysts who made the discovery, it wasn't triumph. It was heartbreak. One of them told me, when I saw his profile align, I felt relief and sadness at the same time. Relief that it worked. Sadness for how long it took. In Fresno, Detective Ruiz, the man who never gave up, got the call around 3 a.m. The lab tech said 6 words he'd been waiting years to hear. We have a viable genetic link. He went back to the office that night, pulled out the case files, read every victim statement again, this time knowing the DNA that connected them finally had a face. From there, everything moved fast. Genealogists mapped out more relatives, narrowing the focus until only one branch remained, Cesar Flores and his immediate family. Detectives quietly pulled property records, utility bills, work logs. They discovered Flores once worked maintenance in areas near the first crime scenes. He'd even serviced the streetlights that mysteriously went out before the attacks. That detail hit everyone like a gut punch. For years, people thought the broken lights were coincidence. They weren't. Imagine knowing you were fixing the same lights you once turned off to hide your crimes. That's how calculated he was. He controlled the darkness, literally. But now, the light was coming back. On paper, Flores looked harmless. Married once, 2 grown kids, a quiet man who liked gardening. No police record, not even a parking ticket. But DNA doesn't care about reputations. It only tells the truth. When his family tree lined up with the Fresno sample, the probability was undeniable, 99.98%. Science had found the ghost, and what the city had lost in fear. It was about to regain injustice. The science did its job. The detectives did theirs. The question is, will you do yours? Subscribe, so this truth doesn't vanish again. Because stories like this die when people stop caring. And the only reason he stayed free for so long is because too many people looked away. After the genetic link was confirmed, investigators obtained a warrant for a fresh sample, a covert one. They followed Flores to a local cafe, watched him sip coffee, toss his cup. An evidence tech retrieved it minutes later. Back at the lab, they tested the saliva on the rim. The code matched exactly. There it was, the undeniable connection between Cesar Flores and every unsolved assault in Fresno. In one moment, a decade of doubt collapsed into certainty. The ghosts finally had a name. Detective Ruiz printed the results, held the pages in his hands, and whispered, "We found you." Years of exhaustion, guilt, and silence dissolved into a single breath of relief. He called his chief at dawn. By sunrise, the Fresno Police Department was back in motion, for the first time, with a suspect who wasn't invisible. A city once trapped in fear was about to watch justice wake up. It's strange how the smallest thing, a single cotton swab, a single database, a single cousin who wanted to know his ancestry, can rewrite a city's story. Technology didn't just solve a case, it restored faith, because sometimes all it takes to find the truth is one drop of blood that refuses to lie. The morning they knocked on his door, and the quiet man who once hid behind darkness finally faced the light, it started like any other Thursday morning in Fresno. The air was cool, the sky still gray, and the streets almost empty. But down on a quiet block near West Shields Avenue, something different stirred. Not chaos, not panic, just a quiet kind of justice walking toward a front door. At 6:43 a.m., unmarked cars rolled up one by one. No sirens, no lights, just silence and purpose. Detectives moved in formation, gloves tightened, voices low, eyes steady. For them, this was the day they'd waited almost a decade for. The house was ordinary. Single-story, beige paint fading under sun, a lawn neatly trimmed. The mailbox still read Flores in faded black letters. Inside was the man whose DNA had tied 5 assaults together and shattered half a city's peace. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, confused, curious, nervous. They didn't see police raiding a criminal. They saw officers knocking on a neighbor's door. The man who smiled, who watered his yard, who never made trouble. And then he appeared. Barefoot, gray shirt, calm eyes, his face the same one they'd seen every morning for years, now framed by badges and handcuffs. He didn't run. He didn't speak, as if he knew. The past had finally caught up. Detective Michael Ruiz read him his rights, the same detective who had refused to let this case die. Flores said nothing. He just nodded. Maybe he already knew there was no escaping this kind of truth, because when the evidence is your own blood, there are no words left to say. Neighbors stood on their porches watching. Some covered their mouths, some whispered prayers, others just stared in shock, trying to fit this image into the memory of the man they thought they knew. A woman 2 houses down whispered, "That's Cesar? No way. He fixed my leak last year." Another said, "He used to walk his dog past here every morning." And for the first time, everyone on that street saw how evil sometimes wears a polite smile. He was led to the back of the car slowly, head low, expressionless. Not once did he look back at his house. Not once did he ask why. He just sat down, eyes forward, like a man who'd been waiting for this knock his whole life. For the officers, there was no cheering, no celebration, just the sound of the door closing. After 9 years of chasing a shadow, the sound of a door clicking shut was enough. As his car pulled away, neighbors watched in silence. Some cried. Some just stood there, arms folded across their chests, unable to look away. Because when a monster lives among you that long, seeing him go feels unreal. At the station, Cesar Flores was processed like any other suspect. Mugshot taken, prints scanned, swab confirmed. The DNA matched 5 rape cases and possibly more. Each one now considered part of a pattern stretching from 2016 to 2021. There were also indications of child abuse under investigation, crimes that may have never been reported. His own blood was the evidence. His own history was the confession. For the first time in years, the names of the victims had power again. Power over the one who tried to erase them. 2 days later, he was brought before the Superior Court of Fresno County. The hallways were packed. Reporters, survivors, officers who refused to retire until this day came. When he entered the courtroom, the air changed. Everyone expected anger or fear, but instead there was just stillness. He walked in like a ghost who'd finally been seen. He didn't flinch when the charges were read. He didn't turn when his name was called. It was as if he'd already accepted what the DNA had decided. The judge spoke slowly. 5 counts of sexual assault, pending charges of child abuse, each one carrying decades behind bars. Cameras flashed. His mugshot appeared on every screen that night. The same blank stare that once hid in plain sight, now frozen forever in digital memory. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. Flores kept walking. One journalist called out, "Do you feel sorry for what you've done?" He didn't answer. He just stared ahead, silent, vacant, as if he knew no answer could undo the truth. One detective watching him said, "It wasn't relief I felt. It was sadness that he ever existed in our city. In the days that followed, survivors began to speak again. One woman sent a letter to Detective Ruiz that read, "For the first time in years, I slept without the light on." Another victim wrote, "Seeing him in handcuffs didn't erase what he did, but it gave me back my voice." That's what justice really is. Not revenge, not closure, but breathing without fear. Ruiz told me he didn't go home that night. He stayed at the station, sitting alone with the files until sunrise. When asked why, he said, "Because when you spend years chasing a shadow, you don't just turn the lights off when it's over." He kept those files open on his desk as the sun rose over Fresno. Photos of the victims now bathed in morning light. It was the first time in years that light didn't feel like an interrogation. It felt like peace. He's behind bars now, but justice only lasts if we remember. The moment we stop telling their stories, we start inviting the next one. Subscribe. Not for me, but for them. Or head to the comments and tell me why some names deserve to be forgotten. Because forgetting is how they win. As of today, Cesar Flores sits in county jail awaiting trial. His charges carry a possible sentence of 264 years to life. He will never walk these streets again. But his arrest did more than end a man's freedom. It ended a city's silence. For years, Fresno was defined by fear. Today, it's defined by resilience. People walk their streets again, not because they've forgotten, but because they refuse to live in the shadow he left behind. Every lamp that flickers on at night now stands as a reminder that darkness doesn't win when the light keeps burning. He thought he could hide forever behind normalcy, behind routine, behind a smile no one questioned. But the truth has a way of waiting, and sometimes it waits right outside your door. Fresno can breathe again, but for many, the damage can't be undone. For 5 women and possibly more, the nightmares finally have a name. For the detectives who never stop believing, closure came not with applause, but with silence. In Fresno tonight, candles burn for those who never got their justice, and for those who finally did. Streets that once felt haunted are quiet again, not because the fear is gone, but because people can finally exhale. Every headline fades, every broadcast ends. But what remains are the lives behind the story, the women who survived, the detectives who refused to surrender, and a community that learned to keep its lights on. The city isn't the same. The faces have changed, but the memory lingers. In the air, in the corners, in the silence between passing cars. Ask anyone who lived here through those years, and they'll tell you, justice didn't erase the fear. It just gave it a name, and that name was Cesar Flores. They say time heals all wounds, but some wounds never close. They simply stop bleeding, long enough for people to live again. The mothers who once slept by the door now sleep in their beds again. The daughters who once carried pepper spray now carry hope. And Fresno can finally breathe. Headlines fade, memories fade. But the truth stays. He thought he got away for good. But DNA had other plans. Science doesn't forget. Justice doesn't die. And for the women who lost their voices, this story, this truth, is how they speak again. If you've watched this far, you believe truth matters. Subscribe now, because the moment you leave without clicking, another story like this fades into silence. And if you won't subscribe, then step into the comments and tell the world why justice doesn't deserve your attention. Because remembering isn't entertainment. It's responsibility. For Fresno, for the victims, for everyone who's ever been told to forget, this story isn't over. It's proof that truth always finds its way home.